Managerial Accounting, Process Costing, Chapter 3, Professor Bolt. This is one of the more challenging chapters, so I always like to give you a warning so that you can kind of focus your attention on this chapter. In Chapter 1, we learned terminology. Chapter 2, we applied that terminology to job order costing, which means discrete individual jobs. So job order costing was where a contractor is building one house. He keeps up with the materials and the labor, and he applies overhead through a predetermined overhead rate, and he figures out how much it cost him to build that home, and he can use that information to determine how much he's going to sell the house for. So Chapter 3 is a little bit more complicated. This is process costing. We will find actually a product that is measured by processes, not by specific jobs. So these companies make large amounts of similar products, and the cost is the same for all units. So we still have materials, labor, and overhead. It's just a different process. And yes, it is process costing. Here's the way job order costing flows. You've got materials, labor, and overhead that flow to one job, or they flow to another job, or they flow to another job. And then when they're finished, they go to the finished goods category. Under process costing, notice this is our new addition. There's an arrow here that indicates that there are several processes. In this example, there's the melting department, the skim and alloy department, and the mold and extrude department before it gets to finished goods. It's one product, and so everything kind of flows all the way through to the end. So again, job order costing, specific jobs that all have materials, labor, and overhead, 3 different jobs. Under process costing, it's the exact same process. It goes on and on and on and gets to finished goods. So here's what we're going to do in this chapter. We're going to compute equivalent units. We're going to prepare a process costing report, and we're going to use FIFO. So let's look at an example. This is a product flow chart for process costing. Let's say that this is milk. You have a homogenization department that has materials, labor, and overhead, and then a pasteurization department where items from this department flow through to here, and then it flows through the packing department, and finally it flows through to the finished goods department. And then here is your finished product. One process, continual operations. So a process costing department has several work in process accounts, whereas a job order costing might have several jobs going on, but they've only got one work in process account. Let's look at an illustration here. Materials, labor, overhead flows into all of our departments. So we're making Chips Ahoy, and we start with the mixing department, and then the product goes to the baking department, and then once the cookies are baked, it goes to the packaging department. When it's finished, it goes to finished goods, and then it goes to cost of goods sold. So the question is that there's a continuous cycle. How much does it cost for materials, labor, and overhead? Because each one of these will have different costs of materials, labor, and overhead. Let's look at it with the T account view. By the way, BWIP is beginning work in process, materials, labor, and applied fixed overhead is AFO. When it's completed, we've got another beginning work in process. Add the items transferred in, materials, labor, overhead. When it's completed, the same process goes through WIP number 3, WIP number 4, potentially WIP number 5, and then we come all the way down to finished goods. So computing equivalent production is pretty easy if you can pause and figure out exactly what we're doing in this one area. So equivalent production is also known as equivalent units. It's trying to figure out how many equivalent whole units you worked on during a period. It's essentially a percentage of completion process that we're going to be doing on partially finished goods. So let's look at this. 4 partially completed tables is the same as 2 equivalent whole tables. So let's say that at the end of a production period, there are 4 partially finished tables in our work in process accounts. Well, they've consumed materials, labor, and overhead, and you can't ignore the fact that there are partially finished goods. You can't just look at the finished goods. And I think that's where we need to stop and try an example from your world, which is the academic student world. If you have 2 term papers due or 2 course papers, course projects, and you've done 25% of one of your projects and 75% of your other project, it would be unfair to say, well, I haven't done any work yet, because essentially, if you add the 25% of one paper to the 75% of the other paper, you've done half of your work. You've done the equivalent of one whole paper, and you should get credit for that. That's the concept with equivalent units. So here's our example. Stool company makes stools, this kind of stools. Equivalent production is shown here. So if we look at this as 1 week, this is the week number 2. At the beginning of the week, there was a stool that was halfway finished, and during the week we started and fully completed 3, and at the end of the week there was 1 stool left in ending inventory that was 75% complete. So we've done 3 holes, and then this half, and then we've done 75% of this one. So that's kind of the way we look at it, is we look at these specific weeks. So week 1 has already passed in historic proportions. Week 2 is this, and then week 3 we'll finish up this stool because it will be next week's, the 3rd week's beginning work in process. A little bit tricky. The pen casts do help with this. We have to read this note because this is so important. Conversion costs, which, if you recall, are labor and overhead, are considered to be added as each physical unit goes through production. So we've got 1, 2, 3.75 plus 0.5. So we have equivalent production for conversion costs is 4.25. Again, that's 0.5 plus 3 plus 0.75 equals 4.25. Now, this is the biggest statement that causes students the most confusion, and it's this word, but direct materials. So read right here. Direct materials are considered to be added to production at the beginning of the process. So here we're going to have the challenge that conversion costs are going to be calculated separately from direct materials. Because the 4 physical units entered production in week 2, equivalent production is 4.0. And we get that from saying, well, materials were already added here in week 1. But we added all the materials here. That's 1, 2, 3. And then we added all of the materials to this stool that was left over in ending work in process. Why? Because direct material costs are all added to production at the beginning of the process. So, yes, we add all the materials to this one, but we didn't add any. The materials were already there, and we just had to convert this product. A little tricky. Usually students get the handle on it, and it makes a little more sense after they've practiced this a few times. If you want to look at a process costing system, pull up this video. I don't think you can link it from this video that you're watching on SitLearn. However, students really enjoy looking at how a Tesla is manufactured, and it helps to understand because materials are added. That's the steel and the tires and the engine and all the other physical materials that are in this product. And the labor, well, there's not much labor if you watch the video, but it's an intense amount of overhead. When you watch this video, and I think I'll get your interest now, you'll see that a Tesla is actually made through robots for the most part. There's a few people there, but it's mostly robotics. And as you watch this video, you'll see that overhead is the largest cost because overhead is depreciation expense on the cost of these many robots that are used to manufacture Tesla. So I'd suggest you pause the video here and find this YouTube video to watch. Now, back to computing equivalent production or equivalent units, same terminology. It's the sum of work done on partially completed units in the beginning work in process, started and completed units, and the work done on partially completed products in the ending work in process. And again, we divide this up into two parts: direct materials and conversion costs. So equivalent units produced is the sum of beginning WIP plus units started and completed, and again, the work done on partially completed products and ending work in process. So let's look at conversion costs for the stool company. Okay, we have to pay to finish the stool. We have to convert the stool, and we have beginning to end done 3 stools completely, and we've done 3/4 of a stool, and it is an ending work in process. And so that's where we get the 4.25. If you want to go back to that slide, you can of course stream the video backwards. 0.5 plus 3 plus 0.75 equals 4.25. All direct materials are considered to be added at the beginning of production. This is a classroom theory. If you were to do this in actual practice, they would probably do it a little more complicated because the complexity is a bit much for an intro topic. So we make it a lot easier for you. All direct materials are added at the beginning of production. This is a highlight, so let's say that one more time. All direct materials are added at the beginning of production. So the unit that was half completed did not have to have any materials added. However, we do have to add 4 new units. 3 of them that were completely done, and then there was a 4th one that was partially done, so our materials are 4.0. So here's the way we can recap this, and this is the chart that we use. If you were the manager in the stool company, you actually touched 5 stools. You had 1 in beginning inventory. You added no materials, but you did half of the conversion. You had 3 that you started and completed. Notice it's 100% across the board. And your ending inventory consisted of 1 physical unit that you put all the materials in, and you did 75% of the conversion. So you touched 5, you sent 4 to finished goods, and you converted 4.25. Here's a problem that if you want to pause this video and try, see if you've got beginning inventory of 2,000, 13,000 started, 500 partially completed. The beginning inventory of 2,000 has 100% of materials, and here's the trick. And this is where I always wish I had a drum roll or a bell that I could play. So if you're hyper-focused on this, it helps. 40% of those 2,000 units in beginning inventory were converted in the prior period. It's your job to finish them. You have to put the 60% in to finish them. As far as ending work in process, you are accounting for 100% of the materials, and you've done 70% of the conversion costs. A bit tricky. Part 2 that's a bit tricky is this says that you started 13,000. It doesn't say you completed them, and that there were 500 partially completed. So you started and completed 12,500. So as I show you the answer on the next chart, this is a good one to go back and study. several times because you'll see this on the exam with several different examples. This part needs to be filled out. We know beginning inventory is 2,000. We started 13,000. So that means that we've touched 15,000. 2,000 in beginning inventory, starting completed 12,500, ending inventory 500. And then we'll go through and fill out this chart. So again, it's to your advantage to pause and try to practice this problem before you look at the answers on the next slide, which is where we'll go now. Okay, here's the answers. So did you get it right? 2,000 plus 13,000 equals 15,000. Okay, let's look at one tricky part at a time. 2,000 beginning. Why is it only 12,005? Because this says that you started it, but this tells us that there was 500 in ending inventory, just like the problem itself stated. That's something that's extremely easy to overlook, and this is where accounting digs into the details. So 15,000 units to be accounted for. Now let's go to tricky part number 2. Direct materials are assumed to be added at the beginning of the process. So if we have 2,000 units in beginning inventory, we add 0 materials. They were added at the beginning of this process. 12,500 was 100% in materials. Notice even in conversion costs. And the 500 in ending inventory. So why did we add 100% of the materials here? It's because materials are added at the beginning of the process, and we started this process, even though we didn't finish these completely, we added all the materials. Now let's go to conversion costs. This right here is your trick. It says that the product was 40% completed, which means that we have to complete the other 60%. And then units started and completed 100%. Ending inventory, we did 70%. The tricky part being here with the wording. When it tells you that there are 2,000 units in beginning inventory, they have all their materials, and they are 40% complete, you have to finish them. And in order to finish them, you have to do another 60%. Okay, this course only studies FIFO, which makes it much easier for you. Upper level accounting classes will be doing the rest of it. So if you're an accounting major, you will see this in intermediate or the upper level managerial accounting. Now, here's another example. This one's in the textbook. Here we've got 63,700 units to account for. Again, notice the way they do this. Units started 57,500, but of those, 5,000 are in ending inventory. So you have to be patient when you do this type of problem. And note that these are the physical units we touched, 63,700 for this product. We started 57,500, and let me show you something interesting. That 57,500, once you start it, that means that you've added all of those direct materials. But there are 5,000 left in ending inventory that we subtract from the unit started to show that we started and completed 52,500. Okay, so no materials needed for beginning inventory. That's a pretty basic rule. 100% for all units started, whether they're finished or not. Part 2, conversion costs. Let's see if I can change my pointer here for a minute, because I think this might help. Okay, so let's just focus on this type of part here. So part 2, 6,200, excuse me, and beginning inventory, and they were already 60% finished, so you have to finish the other 40%. It's a multiplication to get this number right here. The 52,500 doesn't change. And the 5,000, this is the work that you did, 45%. So why is this tricky? Because this shows us, as this chart tells us, units of effort. What did we do during this accounting period? We did 40% to finish up beginning inventory. We did all of the units started and completed. And we did 45% on the units that were left over in ending inventory. Yep, a little bit tricky. So the next thing that we have to look at is this. How much money did we spend? So here's the answer. In the direct materials area, we did the equivalent of 52,500 production. In conversion costs, we did the equivalent of 57,230. So we are going to be given the amount of dollars that we spent to do this work and to do this work. And then we'll find out how much it costs for one. Let me say that again. So here we have it. You're given that this is the dollars spent on materials. You're given that this is the dollars spent on conversion costs. And you just calculated on the prior chart your equivalent units. So it costs $3.30 for materials, $5.60 a unit. For conversion costs, that comes out to $8.90. Here we have it shown another way, $8.90. So remember, you're going to be given the amount of materials and conversion costs. And at this stage, you should stop and say, okay, do I remember what conversion costs are? And of course, you're missing labor and overhead, so that's a pretty simple one. You also need to remember as well that you're really taking a basic materials divided by equivalent units of production and conversion divided by equivalent units of production. Add them together, and you'll come out with the total cost per unit. And this isn't whole units, it's equivalent units. Okay, some preparation tips. This isn't terribly hard unless you don't pay attention to the wording. So, big reminder. And this is going to be extremely important when you're preparing your homework for Chapter 3. So first of all, beginning work in process may say something like August 31st. And that's kind of strange for some students. Depends on how your instructor taught. August 31st is the same as September 1st in the accounting world. The end of last month is the same as the beginning of this month. So always keep that in mind as you're looking for beginning work in process or ending work in process. That's a tricky one. Here's another tip that I always have to remind students. Often, units started and completed are not given. We've seen that in the last two examples that we have. Sometimes you're going to have to do some subtraction. So again, here's another piece of detail that process costing requires. There will be problems where it says how many units were started by the company. And then there'll be another problem where they tell you how many units are started and completed. Pay attention to look for the difference. So if they tell you how many units are started, they need to also tell you how many are left over in ending work in process. If they tell you the number of units started and completed, you don't need to subtract out ending work in process. Yes, I know that's a bit confusing, but maybe after a couple of tries with your homework. Okay, here's an example, and we're trying to figure out how much does it cost for one car. That's all we want to know. What's the cost per unit for one car? We're going to add conversion costs and direct material costs. So on Monday, there are 30 cars in the assembly line, and they have already been 30% converted. So there you're going to finish this. Okay, materials go here, and you actually add 0. So in this part, you're going to have absolutely nothing. It's going to be a 0. Conversion costs, well, there are 30 cars, and they have already been 30% converted. So what are you going to have to do here? 70%. Next, work started and completed, 60 is going to go all the way across the number 60. Finally, there are 20 cars left on the assembly line. They have all materials added, and they are 60% converted. And so that's the information you're going to put here. So if you want to find out the cost for one car, you're going to take your answer here and your answer here and divide it into the cost for materials and the cost for conversion, and you will find out how much it costs to manufacture one car. Now, unfortunately, I don't really have the capacity with this video to type or to clearly write the answers in, but if you want to try this problem, maybe do the template that's going to look like this, and if you'd like, send me an email and I'll be glad to do the problem for you. Just remind me that it's the process costing problem found on the PowerPoint, and I'll go back through and send you the solutions. The best possible way to learn how to do process costing is to practice more and more and more. Okay, there are lots and lots of pen casts. You need to listen to them in order. One of them is how to calculate equivalent units. And then there's another one that has book bag calculations. And the book bag calculation example goes from beginning to end. Maybe after you listen to the book bag calculation pencast, you can try the prior slide and you'll be able to be successful with it. Okay, I hope this helps. I know that process costing is challenging, but I know that if you take some time and some focus, go back, maybe listen to this video twice,